Hello, I'm Kenric. I'm the founder of Photrek that's been providing projects on governance and machine learning within the Cardano and Singularity Net communities. And my colleague Nori is joining me, who has been a fabulous facilitator for a whole variety of conversations throughout the Catalyst Circle and other programs within Cardano. And we're going to talk about something called dynamic governance, or it might be better known as sociocracy. I like both of the terms. And different groups within Cardano have sort of toyed with these things, but from what I've observed, it's not been fully implemented. But I think it's a missed opportunity. And I think we should dig deeper into this. I had an opportunity to meet one of the founders of these ideas, John Buck. And after reading his book, I felt like it was important enough that we're starting to try to use it within our own company. So Nori put a few slides to introduce the ideas around sociocracy, and then we're going to open it up to a discussion. And to kick it off, I actually put one slide together talking about the limitations of voting in using votes to have groups make decisions. So let me start with that, and then Nori's going to give us a little introduction. So let me share the right screen. All right, so can everyone see that slide?
Yep.
All right. So again, I'm going to dive in with. Why didn't it advance? Okay, there we go. And let me make this a slideshow. Is that better? Can you see that better now? And I can't see it at all, so that's helpful. What happened here? I don't know what the thing's doing.
I think the slide showing to a different screen, we just still see this original view.
So you're not seeing the slide view.
Not yet, but we do see the slide. Oh, there it is.
Okay. Something happened when okay. Very good. So in one of the videos Charles Hoskinson gave last week, in talking about governance, he made the point that Voltaire was actually a skeptic of democracy and voting. And of course, at the same time, he was a strong advocate of liberal governance and one of the leaders of the Enlightenment. So this list I put together is sort of my own conceptualization of some of the problems. I'm not suggesting that this is what Voltaire suggested, but what our team has been trying to work on for the community is, given the desire to build a decentralized community, and given the fact that we're currently using one coin, one vote as a process for making decisions as a community, what are the limitations of that? And as we go to governance of the actual network, this is going to become even more important. So, for instance, we have a long history of how majorities can ignore and even abuse minorities. In the United States, where I'm a resident, one of the remedies to that is our Bill of Rights, which essentially encodifies the limitations of what majorities cannot do in a democracy. But you still get this problem of creating winners and losers. And so you have this problem of creating divisiveness through the very process of trying to decide what the majority opinion is. Another issue that arises that our team has worked on quite a bit is that majority power grows non-linearly. I won't go into that in depth, but we did some research on that about 18 months ago, and we have become advocates of a process called quadratic voting, which tries to level that concern by increasing the cost of correlating votes together. And I think I'll just comment on this. I think this is part of why the formation of parties is so dominant in democracies, because as you can form a party, you get this nonlinear increase in your power. And then, of course, we're currently using a corporate style one coin, one vote. And this absolutely leads to centralization for a lot of reasons. So you have this nonlinear growth in power as you can correlate votes, and then that gets married with existing wealth disparities in any economic community, and the combination really will lead to a centralization of who makes the decisions in the community. And then finally, it's hard to make decisions, and majorities don't always get the right decision. So, for instance, in the scientific domain, we don't take votes on deciding what the laws of physics are. Individuals do experiments and make proposals on what they think might be principles of science, and then others are free to criticize those ideas. And through that process of analysis and criticism, individuals in the scientific community adopt standards that become more widespread. But it's a more organic process, and it doesn't involve voting. So with that kind of preface to what the limitations of voting are, I'm going to hand it over to Nori, who's going to introduce a very different process for making decisions in a community.
Thanks, Kenric. Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about sociocracy. And just for clarity, it's one of many models out there, but it's the one that we wanted to talk a little bit about today, since it has some kind of impact in the current Catalyst. And back when the Catalyst Circle was first being formed, IOG called upon Governance Alive to set up a process for the initial circle. And Governance Alive, if you're not aware, is run by John Buck, and he used a number of principles of sociocracy to set up the original circle. And I ran into it through being selected to be on the original ADA holder selection committee, and he ran those meetings in a sociocratic manner. And that's kind of where I had my first introduction to sociocracy and the methods of it. So the model of sociocracy it aims to create a more equitable, efficient, and harmonious organization. And it uses consent-based decision-making versus consensus decision-making to ensure that everyone's voices are heard and considered. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in just a second. It employs circle-based organizational structure, and that's kind of how Catalyst Circle got its name, is because of these circles. And circles are really like functional units and groupings of people that work together for a specific goal. And an organization is envisioned to have multiple circles within it, or even circles that encompass other circles. And there's mechanisms for how all of those circles collaborate and interact in the system. It's based on the principles of transparency, accountability, and continuous improvement. And studies have shown that it increases productivity, employee satisfaction, overall organizational effectiveness, and offers a flexible and adaptable approach to governance. And it doesn't set out a hard set of rules, but it's very adaptable, and you can customize it to fit the unique needs of whatever your organization needs. So in a high level, this is kind of a diagram that discusses how a peer-based governance system works using consent as its core model. So we talked about circles. It's a trusted team of peers, and they're usually pretty small, 4 to 8 people. One of the big concepts of sociocracy, and you'll also find this in Holocracy, which is a similar system, is double linking, where you have one leader from a higher circle coming into an inner circle, and then a representative of that circle being represented in that other circle as well. So you have 2 people that link back and forth. So you have representatives from a kind of higher level meta perspective, as well as on the ground people that are working there. So you have both those viewpoints available in both circles. Decisions are based on consent. So there's another slide after this where I'll talk a little bit about how consent works. It is not consensus. It's found that consensus really doesn't scale very well when you get past a small group of people. So consent is a mechanism that allows you to hear objections and use a principle called yes and, which is really to be inclusive of opinions and different things to modify proposals so that you can get everybody to a point where they're either comfortable that it's okay to move forward, or B, it's safe enough to try. And then if it's like a two-way door where you can try something and then analyze if it went well or not, then it's okay to proceed with that first initial experiment. There's built-in feedback mechanisms and information flows so that there's continuous improvement happening. And the real goals are to share information between circles and decentralize power across the organization. So circles are given a lot of autonomy to make decisions for those things that the circle itself is the direct frontline people working on. So we talked about consent and not consensus as a key decision-making mechanism. And really, you see that circle there with the little inner circle. The inner circle is your preference. So when a topic comes up and there's a proposed solution to it, we all have our preferences of what should be the right decision. But there's a larger space there, which is our range of tolerance. So that may not be our preference, but we think it's okay. It's within our range of tolerance that it can move forward as is. So that's the concept of consent, is all decisions should be within a person's range of tolerance, not necessarily their preference. And if there is an objection, that's because it's outside of your range of tolerance. And then there's discussion and mechanisms on how to go through that and discuss it and expand the solution space so that it starts to include different aspects so that it becomes part of your range of tolerance. And then that's what we call consent, is when everybody there feels comfortable that it's safe enough to move forward. So that's the key mechanism in sociocracy. And then the final slide is just a list of resources here. And I'll share the link to this slide deck in a sec, but there's some sociocracy websites. There's an interesting sociocracy 3.0, which kind of combines the traditional sociocracy with holocracy and a few other things. So it's kind of an evolution that has emerged recently. And then Kenric alluded to a book. I wasn't sure which one it is, but I listed two of John Buck's books here. One is We the People, Consenting to a Deeper Democracy. And then his latest book is Company-Wide Agility with Beyond Budgeting, Open Space, and Sociocracy. So those are available to look at. So that's just a quick introduction to what sociocracy is, to form the kind of container for our conversation here today. So
thank you very much. And I will just now, so I don't forget, put the link to these slides in case anyone wants to take a closer look at it. I don't remember, did we make this public, Nori? I'll copy the link. If you can make it public, that would be helpful. Let's see. Just give me a moment.
yeah, it's public to comments, so you can share the link.
Yep. Okay, great. Thank you, Nori. That was terrific. And it was exciting to hear that you had some direct background with John's original work for Catalyst Circle. I met him at the Cardano Summit in November in Washington, D.C., and then picked up his book and actually just had a conversation with him last week. So I think these are really wonderful principles to learn for all kinds of different settings. And in learning about it, I also felt like I've learned a lot through serving on the circle and participating in the Cardano Catalyst programs. But after reading his book, I felt like we've not really tapped into the core of his principles and what makes them so effective. So I was going to start with a question for the group, and sort of either if you've had experience with something like sociocracy, or if you've had experiences in group decision making that are different from just voting processes. It'd be good to hear some of those experiences as a starting point. And you can either go ahead and just chime in to begin with, or you can raise your hand if, we've got a large group. So if we get, but for now, just go ahead and chime in if you want to, or otherwise raise your hand and I'll call on you.
Can we start with just a quick raise of hands? Like, who here is familiar with sociocracy and has used it in any kind of context? I'm just curious if it's brand new or if people have been working with it.
Yeah, so it's 3 or 4,
couple of
and who, maybe the follow-up question is, who has never heard of this and it's brand new? Anyone? Is it for anyone? Is this brand new? Okay. All right, great. So we've got a mix. Someone want to start with sharing their experiences in group decision making?
I can share mine.
Yeah, great.
My name's Mike Chandler. I'm here in Southwest Florida, and I just we in regards to HOA, it's always funny how in group decision making, and it kind of tilts over to regular voting. We have a group of about 5,000 people, and we have to agree on certain items, and it's always the squeaky wheel gets the wool kind of thing, where most of the crowd is silent, just listening, and where one or two people stand up and propose a position and get really emotional about it, and then that persuades the whole group. In reality, that's not the best decision for the thing, but nobody actually counteracts it on the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Mike. That's a great point, and maybe we'll come back to that a little bit after we've heard some more input. I know you introduced yourself earlier, but I need the prompt clarity. So
Yeah,
why don't you introduce yourself again?
Yeah, super interesting, and thanks for kind of sharing this this different way of thinking about governance. I'm part of the project Clarity, which is we're building governance infrastructure for Cardano projects. And right now we work with a lot of different projects that kind of want to do governance in different ways. So there might be multiple policy IDs that they want to have different voting weights. They might want to have quadratic voting so that larger whales in their ecosystem don't just overrun the vote. And there's also a big emphasis, or a lot of people like the idea of ranked choice voting. And I think that kind of goes along with that kind of circle graphic where you have your preference and then you have your kind of mode of tolerance. But I'm interested to kind of understand, for when someone's tolerance isn't, tolerant enough to agree with, some opinions or outlooks in their community, how does a decision come to fruition? Because I always have this kind of thought process in my head of decentralization. There's this perfect decentralized world that we can imagine, but then there's also benefits to centralization in terms of streamlined decision making and things like that. So I don't know, just kind of thinking out loud at this point, but really interesting to work with all these different projects and understand all these different ways they're thinking about governance, because there's a lot of ideas, I will say that.
Yeah, I have some thoughts on that, but actually what I'll do is take your question and open it to the group. So one of the challenges is this process of voicing objections and then coming to a resolution about objections. So I have some thoughts and insights about it from my reading and my conversations with John, but I'd like to open it up to the group actually to either comment on that or maybe offer some insights.
I just put a link in for on rounds in Sociocracy that explains a little bit about that, but the whole objection process isn't to voice personal preference objections. It's to surface things that'll actually damage the organization or be it's not a two-way door or something that's dangerous to try. So it's very important to listen to those objections and kind of surface what the core thing is that the people are thinking is not acceptable. And then I talked about yes and earlier, and that's really to expand the scope of what you're proposing to include that objection and really address it to say, yes, that is a valid objection. If we do this, we may lose sales, or it may cause this segment of the community to leave. So we're going to do this to modify it so that that objection gets handled in some way. So it's kind of a way of expanding the scope of a proposal so that it's more inclusive and more complete, rather than a narrow kind of focus.
Thanks.
So that at a
Thanks.
high level.
Yeah. James, go ahead.
Kenric, I really appreciate you bringing this up, and Nori for organizing it. And even to Quasar's point in the chat, like to see DRAPs work like this. It's so important for us to tell each other that this is a place we have to get, but I think it's also valuable to temper our expectations and kind of name why it's challenging. So implementing sociocracy, even on a team that already trusts each other, is hard, right, in person, because you're asking people to do something that maybe they haven't had a chance to practice doing before. And so our challenge includes all of that, and doing it remotely is even harder. So running open spaces with a Zoom call is much harder than doing it in person, right? Asking people to get good at voicing valid objections in a remote setting like this, where we've generated an incredible amount of trust in this community, right? But still it's a challenge, right? Like, always when I raise an objection, I feel like I'm stepping on somebody's toes, right? And I can't sense them the way I do if I'm sitting around a table with them. So I think it's valuable just to name the reasons this is challenging in general and challenging in particular for us here, but then to tie that back to, doesn't blockchain ask a lot of people to change their behavior? And if as a group we can all start to figure out, hey, what are the connections, between what's hard about adopting blockchain and what's hard about adopting sociocracy, I think we can kind of be gentle with ourselves, say it to ourselves lovingly, like, this is a good spot to get to. What are the incremental steps we can get to that spot?
Yeah, that's great, James. Thank you. And I'm curious, do you use sociocracy principles at all within the Gimbal Labs group? Is this something you were personally familiar with? And what's your experience so far been?
Yeah, I talked to Nori a lot about open spaces. I used to travel around facilitating open spaces for giant rooms full of teachers. So I love that structure. I've watched it change how people work. But here in the global Cardano community, we're working with so many people who have never been asked to be a decision maker before, right? And so it makes people so uncomfortable to be thrown into that position. So I think we're still in the scaffolding stage at Gimbal Labs towards sociocracy. But so much of, this is why, for example, we emphasize project-based learning, right? A project gives people a safe context to start practicing things, whether that's blockchain or a governance structure. So we should all keep experimenting, right? It's so important to build these small experiments that are going to lead eventually towards this outcome that I think we all agree on.
Yeah, and let me just address a little of that in Quasar's comment in the chat, and then I'll go to Stephen. I think that I want to be clear, right? There is going to be work going on towards the Voltaire, and IOG and CF will be leading that. And to my knowledge, these concepts are not part of the current design. They're certainly not within the SIP 1694. However, in learning about these concepts in more depth the past 2 months in my own reading, and then I've had conversations since with John Buck and also the Sociocracy for All, I feel like we've kind of missed an opportunity as a community, that there were attempts, there were a variety of attempts to try to implement some of these principles where people might have gotten some experience in using these techniques. But for a variety of reasons, and like you're saying, James, it's not easy. And especially in a very global community where we're collaborating via Zoom calls, it's even harder. But maybe the fact that we haven't fully implemented these yet doesn't mean we should stop. And maybe yet getting more knowledge about them as a community will kind of motivate some people to experiment with it in a more serious way.
If I may, but sorry, Stephen, just what Governance Alive did wrong is it felt like they were coming into this community and wagging their finger at people and saying, you better adopt this, right? You cannot implement sociocracy by that approach.
Right.
They alienated people directly. And the best thing we can do is take that as a lesson, right?
Yeah.
You have to help people feel like they're coming to the idea on their own, that this is approach they want to take on, right? You can't go into a room and say, oh, sociocracy, that's what we're going to do. Y'all better do it, right? You're missing the point if that's the approach.
Yeah. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Kenric, and thanks, Nori. Actually, I think, Nori, you did a very good job there of explaining the difference between consent and consensus, and that in consent under sociocracy, there's a kind of range which can include some dissent, which is very important in our community, but also to highlight when does there is too much dissent, when does it go into complete disagreement. And I was wondering if there's to use our imagination, if there's any opportunity to introduce this to have a kind of a hybrid thing with sociocracy and the SIP 1694, by referring to the paper IG produced in December called Reputation at Stake, and which talks about the issuing of reputation certificates. And if you look at the appendix to that paper, it discusses how you elicit feedback. Which presents unique problems, because it's a bit like, how do you rank people's assessment of each other, So, and the reason why they're trying to do that is to develop some sort of on-chain system of reputation. So that may be a way of having a dialogue between sociocratic principles, particularly the range of consent. Okay, like maybe you could take that range of consent and compare it to how you would elicit feedback in the context of reputation certificates. That's all I'm saying. Thanks.
Thanks,
Thank
Steve.
you,
Do you have
Stephen.
any links you can drop into chat to that paper?
Yeah, I'll drop some links. Yeah.
Great. And I'll come to you in a moment, Big Shrimpin. If anyone wants to respond directly to either Stephen or James, you don't have to raise your hand. You can just chime in, but keep it brief as a kind of response to what they said. Anyone want to go before we?
Yeah, in response to Stephen, don't we already have a system on chain for measuring reputation in a stake pool system? In so much as the more delegation you have through your stake pool, the better your reputation must be to have accrued that much resources.
Yeah, well, that's one way of looking at it, certainly. And I think the paper is interesting, but I think because it's a bit like the Voltaire SIP, it kind of seems to build on that. Like the Voltaire SIP 1694 builds on a kind of voting as transaction. But the paper in December, which I've just, to my shame, I've just sort of read it, is looks at how you might create, how do you deal with reputation in a more general sense across the community, not just stake pool operators.
Thank you. And go ahead, Shrimpin, if you had more you wanted to add to the conversation.
That was it just now. There's a lot of very clever people here that I'd like to hear from first. But yeah, no, the stake pool, the transactional voting system does make a lot of sense. Obviously, I think my views are known on that SIP that I think it adds undue levels of complexity to the overarching governance system, which will it will in effect exclude people from participating in governance. Daniel just earlier today did a poll on how many people have been engaged in Project Catalyst. And we found that the majority of people engaged in Project Catalyst had actually been here for over a year. And it hasn't been running for that long, which means that we're not seeing growth when it comes to this level of engagement in call based on that single data metric from what we could say is perhaps a flawed piece of sentimental analysis. But on the bigger picture approach, I think we should be looking to make systems simpler, give people easier ways to engage, because the more people we have engaged in governance, which you'll see my project does a little bit later, the more we're going to see the true will of the stakeholders, let's say, reflected in the policies and SIPs that are passed.
Excellent. Thank you, Sherman. Yeah, there's definitely challenges, and I'll take a minute and just share a little bit about my own experiences with this. I started Photrek in 2020 as a sole proprietor, and my experience is in research and development. So the way I'm kind of developing the company is through contract research and development, including the Catalyst program and other programs. At the same time, this past year, I felt like I'd gotten far enough along that I wanted to start to open it up to a more employee owner kind of model. And a group of us, including Megan Hess, Bill Thistleton, and Blake Anderton, are in those conversations now and working towards that model. And but there's a variety of things that have to come together. We have to have more consistent funding. We have to have a clearer vision about product development. There's a whole variety of things to try to grow and develop the company further. And in the midst of that, I attended the Cardano summit in Washington, D.C. in November, which was really terrific to meet a few people in person finally after 2 years of Zoom collaborations. And one of those people was John Buck, who was on the panel with me. And so in reading on the principles of sociocracy, what I realized and have begun to implement within Photrek is how it really shifts the way you think as a leader. The first things that I've observed is going through these round processes and allowing people to kind of express objections to an idea forced me as a leader to listen actively rather than passively. And the difference, what I mean is, we often as leaders, it's easy to get into a mode where you open up space for people to express concerns or new ideas, but then in the end, you have an expectation that as the leader, you're going to make the decision. And I kind of see that now as a kind of passive listening, whereas on a recent proposal that we did with a new team, one member of the team was concerned that the budget for his part of the project didn't match what he needed to accomplish. And within that meeting, it really helped me think about how to embrace his objection and work with the whole team to find solutions. So for instance, our sponsor was in that meeting, and the sponsor agreed to relax one of the requirements as something that could be done later. And then other team members were willing to kind of allocate some of their budget to his tasks, seeing that there were things about what he was trying to accomplish that were going to require more resources. So I think those kind of conversations that we've observed in just the last month and a half of working under this framework have been really terrific. Maybe we can get to the question that was raised with regard to how could this become a wider part of the culture of Cardano? And as said, that there were some attempts to bring this into the circle, but some of it was implemented, some of it wasn't. And as James said, I don't think it's not appropriate to force this on a community. But I'm wondering, like, on one level, I think if there are people that are interested, maybe some of us could begin to work and develop these practices within our own organizations and kind of interlink those organizations. So there might be some organic growth. And then there could also be some advocacy within the designs for Voltaire under SIP 1694 of, where does this process fit in to the future of Cardano governance? And, given the limitations on only making decisions by voting, how are we going to address the concerns of minorities in the community? How are we going to address the centralization of power under that kind of a system? And how are we going to address how are we going to address the fact that sometimes people make the wrong decisions? And whatever process you use, you might make the wrong decision and have to have processes to correct those actions. So are there any thoughts on either organic growth of these kind of models or advocating that this be part of the SIP 1694 design? Nori, go ahead.
I just had a thought. I think I'm interested. There's other people that are interested in practicing models like this, maybe forming some kind of an intentional practice community under some kind of real life thing, not just like a fake practice, but say have the next tool makers and maintainers roundtable use this thing, or whatever it is that people can join if they're really interested. And it can be twofold. One is to actually get some kind of collaborative business done, but also to practice the principles of sociocracy and see how it fits and try it out. There may be opportunities for that. If anybody's willing to jump in, I'm totally happy to participate too.
I think respectfully, just before Roki jumps in, this goes under the presumption that the community wants a sociocracy. I and my co-founder, one of my many co-founders, Emalola here, and our chief scientific officer, who's been doing some sentiment analysis on the Cardano community, has found that it's not necessarily a consensus, particularly amongst the people that don't engage in Catalyst, but do engage in the DeFi ecosystem of Cardano, that they want sociocracy at all. There have been some radical extremes that want, a liquid monarchy with Charles as king. There are some less radical ideas that want a pure capitalist model based on a republican principle. And some, of course, want direct democracy. So to presume that sociocracy is the answer in the first place, I think, is a silly place to start from. And ultimately, we'll find out from the numbers when this goes to voting. I think that SIP is deeply, deeply flawed. And I think that if it passes, I know our team and many others in the ecosystem will be moving to Ergo if it does. That, along with the contingent staking debacle, which is hopefully going to be resolved soon. And I think the greater question is, how do we know what the community want if it's only the vocal minority that are telling and talking and debating this?
Yeah, this is absolutely a valid point. And I'm not raising this discussion today to suggest that this is the way we have to go forward. In fact, I can give another example where there was an attempt towards these methods, but again, it kind of fell short a bit, was that under Circle 3, the proposal advisors formed a subcircle, and that subcircle was, now that at the time I wasn't really very familiar with these principles, but as I look back, I now see a little bit more about what they were trying to accomplish and the roles they were defining within that subcircle. I think they took a step to put an organization together called Catalyst United. And I think that word united was maybe a strategic misstep in the sense that it gave the impression that they were seeking to impose a structure on the community. And the community hadn't really provided any authorization for them to do that. So at the same time, I think there are processes that grow up organically where people choose to form particular kinds of organizational structure. That's important to as part of the conversation. And then the reality is we work right now under a federation of 3 corporations that founded Cardano network, and they are going to provide leadership in moving to a Voltaire governance where there's going to be community involvement, but there's going to be, those original federated actors are going to be very influential in the design.
Perhaps too influential. And before we go to Rocky, because I know he's been waiting very patiently.
Actually, Big Trim, I am going to go to Rocky because he was actually
okay.
Yeah, but thank you, and I look forward
Hypocrisy
to hearing
again.
more from you. Go ahead, Rocky.
Hey folks. I actually was gonna be on topic. I was just, being, courteous, raising my hand. And I did appreciate what Big Shrimpin was saying. I might word it differently sometimes, but I know he likes to have fun. And I was gonna make the point of something kind of just brief that it still does feel like, and I know it's being addressed in comments and in people's other, subsequent commentary, but it feels like a boys' club still here, And as I said in the last week's meeting, I participated in something like this in real life with an employer, and it was a very long process, very nuanced, very different, patient. It was just very different. And actually, frankly, that was mostly female run. So I was the minority in more than one sense in those discussions. I don't know if that was by design necessarily, but I think it made for really profound discussions, at least the environment for it. And I think that's something I understand, I can recognize that this is analogous to that, but I can also easily see where it feels like it might be doing something somewhat of there's some mistake in here where it feels like it might be trying to fit the old into the new, and I think that I'm curious what the sentiment is around, urgency. Does something need to happen now? I know that the SIP has time parameters around it, but as far as having certain things go forward, are people okay to, as has been said, make mistakes? Because what's the point if you're going to make the same mistakes in a virtual world as is already being exhibited and we've experienced in the real world? We're trying to move away from a lot of paradigms that don't work. So I think it might be worth just really challenging yourselves, and even when you think you've thought it through, think, well, maybe actively working against what you might be inclined to support, or make that I forgot what they call it when you kind of argue against your own argument or whatever. Anyways,
Yeah, thank
I'll
you,
stop
Rocky.
rambling. Yeah, sure.
I'll respond as far as the urgency goes. I think we are moving into the age of Voltaire, so there is going to be active design work by the community to transition from a federation to a community-led, membership-based organization. So now is the moment, if you want to influence that design, now is the moment to be actively involved in those discussions. So that was part of the incentive of putting together these past 2 town halls, and maybe we'll do some more in the coming year as well. So that's sort of the moment is now, in a sense, to influence these designs. And then along that lines, I do, unless there's an urgent need not to, I'm going to plan to close the meeting at the top of the hour, because I do have another meeting. I won't be totally strict on that. I can be a little late to that meeting. But along that lines, I like James's suggestion that, maybe there needs to be sort of some concrete things that we consider trying to take on. And so for example, there's a new work group on tool makers that I'm involved in, and I'm going to bring up these issues and see if at least part of our work maybe would follow these principles and give an evaluation of how well they work, where they're effective and where they have shortcomings. Does anyone else kind of have groups within Cardano Catalyst that they're involved with, where they think these concepts might be able to contribute to the way decision making is done?
Yes, and I'd also like to build on Rocky's points. I think he made it incredibly well, and it was incredibly succinct, that it does seem like Cardano is a bit of an old boys club, and that we could inherit some of the problems of the old system, the problems that we've inherited through Project Catalyst in the new one. Now, I've been very cautious with what I've been saying around this, but now that, and by the way, my entire project is built out of spite. My project does very complex on-chain analytics to check which wallets are related to each other and who owns what wallets, and we dox wallets and all that kind of stuff. And in version 0.15 of the Node Shark, we were able to identify a number of Cardano wallets that were CAs and VCAs that shared common exit points. So they shared common exchanges. In fact, 7 or 8 wallets were rewarded for their CA/VCA work, and then that ADA that they got as a reward went to a single wallet. So we proved on chain, and this will be coming out over the next few weeks and months ahead, that there is a little bit of a problem with the way the system currently works. And the current SIP for governance, though well intended, only serves to entrench those existing power structures by virtue of how it's structured, and only, as Rocky said, risks entrenching or risks building on an old broken system to create another broken system for the future.
Yeah, those are real dangers and concerns. So it's good to hear that you're doing that kind of analysis. Other thoughts? Maybe someone can share like a little bit more about what their own engagement with Cardano Catalyst is at this time, and what kinds of, how do you organize, how are your own teams organized, and what processes do you use?
Sorry, I was typing. Was that to me or just generally?
No, it's general. It's a general question to the group. Well, we have a little bit quieter group than we did last week.
I'd say you guys are my group. How about that?
Excellent. Okay,
I don't really, I'm for me personally, and I know for me it's almost a year for me kind of coming around Catalyst. And this is my way of checking in on like, hey, what's Cardano actually doing under the hood? When I realized that it's actually open to everybody to see, and then I realized you can engage, and I was like, this is awesome. And then when I realized it's pretty much what's going on in Catalyst is what I was doing in the real world, I was like, wow, it's really bizarre, So I mean,
great.
Yeah. So for me, I'm quite comfortable just popping in. I'm like, this is me, this is my check-in group. I've met some folks in real life like Quasar. I might consider, folks like him and maybe Dags and a couple other people that I met in person, like maybe they're closer, maybe the inner circle, if that, on Cardano. Appreciate those folks. And that was just by going out to Rare Bloom, to make some real, connections in person. Anyways, going on a little bit.
That's great.
But
Thanks,
like, yeah, I appreciate, checking in. I don't have subgroups, but
Keith, why don't you go ahead?
No, thank you. I'm been involved in Cardano free catalyst, so shame on me for not doing more. But I'm at a stage right now where I'm part of an online community whose goal is to create 1,000 generous millionaires. We have passion projects, things that we want to do to help change the world. And what I would like to do is develop something in the way of an educational token that we can use within our community, and also see if we can utilize it to develop the funding for these passion projects. But I envision a wallet that has 3 sections in it, built on the Cardano network, where it can be I don't know if it would be switched on or what, but the wallet would have 3 parts, and it would be a section for the students where they could keep track of their schedules and their homework assignments, attendance, those kinds of things. So student records, and for the staff, something for the staff, and then something for the instructors, and I'll have it kind of be interactive. There's certain portions that you could switch on and off, and maybe token rewards if students did their homework, etc. So it's just exploratory at this point. But wouldn't it be nice to develop that technology and offer it outside of our academy? So that's the vision I have for Cardano, and
Nice.
I just find that the Catalyst program, like I said, I was around Cardano and before Catalyst even was a project. And so Emergo and Cardano were working, and someone suggested maybe go over to Emergo. And I kind of looked into it for a second and thought, well, I don't have the money to develop anything, and so I just kind of sat on it year after year, and now I see an opportunity to put some genuine utility behind it. And I would like to maybe in Fund 11 be able to do something along those lines. And it's interesting because our academy is called XIXI, which Roman numerals for 1111. So the universe leaves clues, so who knows.
Great. Thank you
Indeed,
for
it
sharing
does.
that experience, Keith. Appreciate it. Danny, I appreciate you joining us and listening in. As the public spokesman for Catalyst, do you want to share a little bit, in terms of what the experience has been like, working as sort of the public representative of Catalyst, and how that influences governance of the program? I'm putting you on the spot, but you're always getting put on the spot every day, right?
Yeah, it always comes down to the fact like how diverse the communities are. We always talk about the concept of Cardano community, but it's always like this weird mesh of community of communities, and each one of them has a different idea of, like, first of all, why they may be here, what they're motivated by, and how they want to conduct themselves, in which spaces, in which format, which channels to utilize. And that also ties ultimately to the fact like how they want to govern themselves, how they want to achieve the decision, the consensus, and things of that nature. And I think that's also highlights the challenge initially when we talk about sociocracy and everything else, that it's like, it may not be everybody's cup of coffee, right? Like everybody has their own perception of how they would like to go about it, which is shaped by the experiences they've had in the legacy world, of course. And a lot of people are trying to, what is the better way to do it? But in the mix of those things, it's like, how do we bring people together in a square and get them agreeing on a direction? And I like in the chat, a few people were suggesting like governance experiments. I think we haven't been doing enough of that. Obviously, Catalyst is one example of it, but I think there's definitely room for other instances of like, can we try this? Can we try that? But then again, You need people, you need interest, you need resources, and that's one thing that's generally it's it's unfunded, and it's not only in Catalyst or in Cardano, but in the world more broadly, right? Like these are not generally the topics that people will run towards and like, oh, let's have fun and try to figure out how to crack the governance. So
Yeah, that's
it's
perfect, Danny.
so that's in that sense, and like the CIP again, it's in a separate lane out of Catalyst, but I think what Catalyst has allowed that it has such a broad range of engagement of people. So like to the poll earlier, about 60% of people on the call itself have been here longer than 12 months. I think broadly speaking, there's a lot of talent and interest and situational awareness what the challenges are actually within the Cardano ecosystem, and bring those to the table of the conversations of CIPs, right? Because there's going to be different levels. There's going to be technicalities. How can this be implemented on chain?
Right.
First of all, and then like how do humans interface with that chain? Because the governance, no matter what tools you have, you still need to engage with humans, and figuring that part out is the challenging part. And that CIP, the first CIP version, is a rough draft of like stepping in a direction, figuring out like what that could be, and that's why engaging and big shrimping perspective like that is important, to find time if you can and drop it directly on a GitHub and let the people know there, because that will spark other people who may be also failing in the same way, or may be inspired to talk about the subject in the way they haven't considered yet.
You are all more than welcome to join the closed alpha test of NodeShark. You can visit nodeshark.io or discord.gg/nodeshark.
Love it.
All right.
It reminded me of like my freemium Spotify. You're listening to music.
Right.
And then there's a commercial in
All right, so we got our commercial break, and we got Danny's wisdom about diversity of communities. Nori, do you have any closing thoughts as we bring this great discussion to close for today? But we'll definitely be continuing.
No, I'm really thankful for everybody who showed up and has contributed. It's nice to have such a wide, diverse set of opinions and conversations in a nice, safe space where we can bring this stuff up. And yeah, I don't think we're here to decide that sociocracy is the way forward, but it was a great conversation to kind of just let people know what it is, have a conversation around it. And yeah, and if it's going to be of usefulness to your own organizations as an experiment, that might be a really cool experiment to try. But yeah, super happy with all the conversation and all the contributions here today. So yeah, I'm really thankful.
Yeah, this is great. Ken, sorry we didn't get to you. Would you like to go now, or would you like to wait for another conversation? You're welcome to.
It's quick what I wanted to.
Yeah,
it's
go
quick
ahead.
what I wanted to say. So, I just thought that an interesting thing to think about is the scope of decisions that need to be made, and how that relates to having a framework that allows for different experiments to be done, because you don't always have the same scope at which a decision will affect people. And so sometimes people may not like the whole idea of consent. Like you may be able to consent to something that it doesn't affect what you're doing on Cardano. Like you may not be affected by that decision, but like being able to have different experiments in how ideas and how decisions are made that can coexist on the system, and having some underlying structure that allows those different frameworks for governance to coexist.
Yeah, excellent, Ken. All right, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining today. I think this is kind of just an initial set of discussions about governance, and obviously that's going to be a big focus for the coming year. So I think it behooves all of us to kind of take initiative to try to bring improving ideas to how we organize ourselves as a decentralized community. and look forward to talking about these concepts and working on the SIP and with all of you. Thank you. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.